Chapter 16, Act 16, Ursula's Tale. Act 16, Ursula's Tale. The Disciple. Sheila stared at Cain, unblinking as the tip of his lance hovered above her throat. Ursula could feel the blood draining from her face as her eyes danced back and forth between Cain and Sheila, both figures unyielding in their defiance. The chamber had gone silent. Ursula's heartbeat was roaring in her ears, urging for her to do something, anything, before everything she knew and loved was snatched away by this madman.
Mother, get back!
Ursula hissed, kicking her foot high into the air and smashing it into Cain's throat. With a garbled wail, he stumbled backwards, and Sheila took the opportunity to flee behind the crystal dais, gasping for breath as Ursula stomped forward, her eyes alit with unbridled rage. Before Cain could right himself, she swung her fists, striking him once in the abdomen and following up with an uppercut that sent him sprawling on the floor. Hovering over him, Ursula planted her foot into Cain's chest, reveling in the labored wheezing escaping from his rapidly bruising throat.
What did you do to my father?
Ursula demanded.
I know you stole the crystal chamber key from him. Ha! Your father.
Cain shook his head slowly.
Oh, this is even more delicious than I anticipated. What?
Ursula blinked, but her confusion gave Cain the split second he needed to turn the tables. He grabbed Ursula by the ankles, sinking his nails into her flesh as he pulled her legs out from beneath her, slamming her into the floor. Ursula screamed as her head hit the hard crystal, closing her eyes as stars exploded into her vision. She felt heavy armor and latex fall upon her, knocking the wind out of her lungs as she opened her eyes and found Cain on top of her, kneeling over her hips with his legs clamping her arms to the ground, his lance raised above her head. Ursula's eyes searched his, a striking blue that were pulsing with the crystal's light. He looks like Uncle Cecil, she thought distractedly, her mind still spinning from her fall.
Yeah.
A pair of towering legs struck Cain in the side of his head, and he cried out as he collapsed on top of Ursula, his lance clattering to the floor. Ursula grunted at the sudden weight pressed upon her chest, gasping for breath as she tried to push him away and blink the granules of darkness out of her eyes. A few moments later, a pair of hands threw Cain off of her, and she was greeted by her father's concerned frown. A trail of dried blood was running down his temple to his cheek, and his lip had been split open, but he was alive, glory of glories, he was alive.
Father!
Ursula sniffled, reaching up for his arms. He lifted her to her feet, but quickly turned away, glaring at Cain's fallen form.
Stay focused, Ursula. All right.
Ursula gasped, spinning forward and raising her palms in the air once more, readying her next attack. Cain coughed, pushing himself up to his elbows and grasping for his lance as he started to shake with laughter.
Impressive. You are undoubtedly your father's daughter, girl. But no matter.
He climbed to his feet, giving a quick bow before bending his knees and launching himself into the air, leaping over their heads and landing upon the crystal dais. The light in the room flickered, and the crystal of wind was snatched away from its pillar of light, grasped between Cain's pale fingers. He pressed his lips to the crystal, laughing manically as he gazed into its fading luminescence.
No.
Yang moaned, lowering his head.
Cain. How could you?
Ursula was paralyzed in place, and could only watch with her mouth agape. Cain shook his head gleefully, tucking the crystal under his arm and propping his lance against the dais.
Lest you be confused, allow me to assure you that this is not a repeat of the past. I am acting on my own volition, my own free will.
He jumped down the dais steps, his boots thundering as he hit the floor. Before he fled through the exit, he reached to his hip and tossed something glittering toward Yang and Ursula. It was the key to the crystal chamber, sliding across the tiles and stopping right at their feet. Shaken from her trance, Ursula growled and bolted out after Cain, but was amazed to find that he had already disappeared when she slid into the throne room. The castle was completely silent, the enemy had retreated. In the throne room, Yang had collapsed upon his throne, head in his hands. Ursula was pacing back and forth relentlessly, and Sheila was sitting on the arm of the throne, rubbing her hand in small circles over Yang's back. The Duke Consort and Chancellor had joined them from their hiding places once an Anvale had fetched them and given them the all-clear. Cole was making the rounds to assess the damage to the castle.
In the end, we couldn't stop the crystal of wind from being taken to Baron,
the Duke sighed. Yang moaned, shaking his head.
Forgive me. It was because of my weakness. Who was that guy?
Ursula shrieked.
An agent of Baron's. I've never seen him before. Well, once upon a time,
Sheila frowned.
But the rumors were that he defected from Baron nearly 17 years ago. Quite frankly, I thought he was dead by now since no one had seen hide nor hair of him this whole time. He was leader of the Baronian Dragoon Corps,
Yang explained tiredly.
Kane Highwind. Ex-Baron military.
Ursula raised her eyebrows.
He seemed to be around Uncle Cecil's age, would they have known each other? Uncle Cecil used to lead the Red Wings, right?
Yang hesitated. At this point, he supposed it didn't matter.
They were best friends. They went to the moon together, too. What?
Ursula came to a stop, pressing her hands to her mouth.
Does that mean Uncle Cecil endorses this? Kane said he was doing this of his own free will.
Yang shook his head.
I simply don't know, Ursula. Please. The flames of past wars flicker anew,
the Chancellor sighed.
The other crystals must be in danger as well, if they have not yet already been taken, earth, water, wind, and last, fire. Baron only flexed a fraction of its power. It will only be a matter of time before the others fall as well.
Ursula watched in dismay as her father sunk lower in his throne. The Duke and Chancellor were staring at the floor, and even Sheila was despondent, gazing down at Yang sadly. Ursula marched to the throne, her hands on her hips.
Hey! This isn't over, you know.
Everyone turned to face her. Even Yang raised his eyes. Ursula took a deep breath and waggled her finger.
We haven't lost this battle yet. Not by a long shot.
Yang blinked.
Ursula. We can take back the crystal.
17 years prior. Fabul, Crystal Chamber. A young girl, no more than 7 years old, was kneeling next to a fallen Dark Knight. Her mop of green curls was hanging in her eyes, drenched in sweat as she unsuccessfully tried to shake the Dark Knight to his senses. Yang was collapsed against the crystal dais, the crystal of wind freshly relieved of their care by Kane and Golbez just moments before. Edward was muffling a sob behind his hand, his eyes red and rimmed with tears. The girl sighed, giving up on the Dark Knight and rising, her tiny arms crossed over her chest.
What's wrong with you? They took Rosa, but they didn't hurt her. We just need to rescue her. And the crystal, we can take it back, too.
Fabul, present day. A small smile formed on Yang's lips as he stared at Ursula. Once more, his eyes had been opened by the innocence and wisdom that oftentimes spouted from the mouth of babes. Sweet Rydia had taught him so much about resilience and hope in their short time together, and had made the dream of having a daughter of his own so much more bittersweet in those dark days.
Yes. You're right.
Ursula blinked, taken aback by this sudden change of heart.
Father.
Yang jumped from the throne, rolling his shoulders back and cracking his knuckles as he glanced back at the princess.
Ursula, take care of the castle for me. Where are you going, hun?
Sheila blinked.
To Baron.
The Chancellor nearly jumped out of his robes.
What? That would be suicide.
Yang shrugged.
I must see Cecil about this. There is simply no other course of action at this point. I can't just wait around for another kingdom to be attacked. Well, then I'm coming too.
Ursula frowned, stomping over to Yang.
If Kane Highwind is really there, I need to give him a piece of my mind.
Yang shook his head.
You're staying here. I asked that you please watch the castle. This isn't just Fabul's problem. The entire world is under attack. How can I sit here and watch a pile of bricks and mortar knowing that?
Yang frowned, looking away and crossing his arms over his chest. Sheila sighed, approaching Ursula and giving her a tight hug.
Please be careful, Ursula.
She smiled sadly, holding Ursula's face in her hands and kissing her forehead. Ursula widened her eyes, and Yang spun on his heels, his face red.
Sheila. This is not your permission to give. And nor is it yours,
Sheila snapped, stepping away from Ursula.
She's a woman who can make her own decisions, and the future queen of Fabul. She showed unwavering strength in the crystal chamber with Kane, she saved my life. I can think of no better training for our queen than engaging in diplomacy with foreign nations. You, Cecil, Edward, and King Edge won't be around forever. She needs to depend on her own relationships to blaze a path for Fabul long after you and I are gone. How do you expect her to forge them if she can't engage when it is most critical? I assure you, I'm prepared for whatever happens.
Ursula begged.
I won't be a burden.
Yang looked away. Damn it, Sheila. You're right, as always. He shook his head.
My Duke. Please forgive the selfish deeds of your monarch. May I ask that you watch the castle in Ursula's place?
Ursula gasped softly, and the Duke stifled a chuckle. He couldn't help it, sometimes it was satisfying to see Yang put in his place, he was still human, after all.
Quite all right. I'm not too old to serve my kingdom yet.
Sheila smiled.
The two of us will keep everything running while you're gone.
Yang bowed deeply, his ponytail sweeping over the floor.
Thank you. What can I do to help?
Ursula asked eagerly.
We should get going as soon as possible, right? Princess, why don't you go down to the docks and locate the captain of our fleet?
The Chancellor asked.
You'll need to explain the objective of the mission and how many men you expect to take with you. Yes, sir.
Ursula nodded, quickly counting on her fingers.
Let's see. Me, Father, and Bale and Cole, right? That should be enough. That is acceptable,
Yang said warily, and Ursula nodded, turning and fleeing from the throne room. Yang and Sheila looked at each other, and Sheila grinned.
You should take a cue from her, dear, she's not going to let any of this get her down. With Ursula by your side, you'll be back home in no time. Do not forget, she carries the blessings of the Crystal of Wind, same as you.
After Ursula had made all of the arrangements, the new party of 5 prepared for their departure. Ursula was sitting at the edge of the docks, her bare feet dangling in the water as she stared at her mudded reflection, constantly shape-shifting thanks to the lapping waves. Cane High Wind. So you've graced Fabul with your presence before, it would seem. And you were one of the people who saved our world 17 years ago. Ursula clenched her fist, resisting the urge to spit out of rage into the harbor. What the hell happened to you? If you heard Uncle Cecil, Aunt Rosa, or Theodore, I swear, I'll...
Ah, there you are, dear.
Ursula raised her head, watching as her mother stepped onto the dock, with Yang, and Bale, Cole, the Duke, and the Chancellor in tow. Ursula rose to her feet, an uneasy feeling fluttering in her chest. All of a sudden, their impending journey felt real, and no one had actually disputed that they were indeed on a suicide mission. She slipped into her shoes, and found herself pulled into a tight embrace by Sheila.
Take care of yourself, Ursula. Give it your all out there. Yes, Mother.
Ursula choked, having been pulled into her mother's bosom. She gasped for air and pulled back, flushing. Sheila turned to Yang, her hands on her hips.
Listen, honey. If anything happens to Ursula, I'll make sure you pay for it. And it won't just be the frying pan this time.
Yang blanched, wincing at what Ursula could only imagine was a very painful memory.
Why yes. Yes, my dear. Mother.
Ursula blinked. Sheila stepped away, and the Duke Consort took Yang's hand into his own.
Leave the kingdom's affairs to us. I shall.
The Chancellor snuffled forward, and Ursula could swear she saw tears in the old man's eyes.
Master Yang, Princess Ursula. Please come home safely.
He patted Ursula's arm awkwardly, and all she could do was nod. It was a strange feeling to not be yelled at by the Chancellor, for once. Once they boarded the ship, the captain approached Yang, giving a quick nod to Ursula.
The princess told me everything, Your Highness, make yourselves at home. It'll be a bit of a journey. We'll take the roundabout path for safety, so we may not land in Baron until late tomorrow.
Yang nodded and turned to Ursula, who already run to the ledge of the ship and was waving to the others. And Bale and Cole were watching her, diligently standing guard a few feet away.
Raise anchor, men.
The captain ordered, and the sailors gave a salute.
Aye aye, sir.
Yang approached Ursula, resting one hand on her shoulder while raising the other in departure to Sheila. Sheila waved back with both arms, blowing kisses with tears streaming down her cheeks. As the ship picked up speed and left the port, Sheila and the others began to get smaller and smaller, and soon were nothing more than specks of black against the late afternoon sky.
Mother.
Ursula bit her lip.
Why is she crying? It's going to be okay. She knows that, right? Your mother is watching everything. She has dedicated the last 35 years of her life to float away on this barge,
Yang said softly.
You'll understand when you are a bit older. It never gets easier to say goodbye to the ones you love, no matter how many times you've done it before.
Ursula looked up at Yang, who was still staring in the direction of Fabul, his jaw clenched. She had always thought it was so easy for her father to run off whenever he pleased for training, because that had always been what he had dedicated his life to. But perhaps he was telling her that was not the case after all? She cleared her throat, anxious to break the spell of unspoken anxiety that had settled upon the two of them.
So, what will we do once we reach Farron?
Yang turned to face her.
Attain an audience with Cecil and determine the truth behind these affairs. If we are lucky, Queen Rosa or Sid may be able to help us. We should keep Theodore out of it if at all possible, but I'm sure Rosa is already taking care of that.
Ursula bit her lip. Once again, the haunting visage of Kane Highwind filled her vision, making her heart pound uncontrollably, an undeniable warning racing through her blood.
What if Uncle Cecil's already in enemy hands?
Yang lowered his eyes toward the deck of the ship.
Ridiculous. That could never happen. Not to Cecil.
Ursula snorted, turning away.
How lucky he is.
Yang looked at her questioningly, and she shook her head, gazing upon the twin moons.
You give him such absolute, unwavering trust. Aoic.
Yang and Ursula both looked up, watching as a sailor scuttled down from the crow's nest he had been keeping watch in above them, limbs flying as he raced to the captain's quarters.
What is it?
Yang shouted, and another sailor near the front of the ship, holding a scope, shook his head.
Monsters. Father.
Ursula cried.
We have to help.
Yang nodded.
Ready yourself, Ursula. We must not let them harm the crew.
He nodded toward Bale and Cole, who were waiting on standby for orders.
You three, evacuate everyone below deck. Yes, master.
They chanted, and split off to herd the sailors to safety. Moments later, a bone-chilling scraping could be heard on the ship's hull, and a tribe of Sahajins pulled themselves onto the deck, their claws leaving deep, curling grooves in the wood as they dragged themselves to their feet. They were humanoid fish that could walk and use their limbs to sometimes hold spears, although they typically fought prey with the claws that emerged from their webbed feet and hands. One of them let erupt a shriek that made Ursula's ears ring, tiny rows of piranha teeth gleaming in the retreating sunlight as bands of drool rained from its extended jaw. Turning its lamp-like eyes on Ursula, it lunged toward her, only to be stopped by her foot ramming into its gut.
Yeah.
Ursula grunted, sending the Sahajin smashing into the deck railing and toppling overboard back into the sea with a raucous splash. It only took a few minutes for Yang and Ursula to dispose of the onslaught, which had not been very well coordinated on their enemy's part. When they were sure the coast was clear, they summoned the sailors and the monks back to the deck, and the captain began to stroll about the ship to investigate for damage.
I've never heard of monsters storming the deck of a ship before,
Ursula frowned.
The arrival of the new moon must be affecting the world's creatures in strange and unpredictable ways. You noticed how the number of monsters increased exponentially on the path to Mount Hobbs, did you not? Yes.
Ursula trailed off, staring down at her feet. The memory of getting thoroughly chastised by her father after the mom bomb was still raw. She would have given anything to be able to wake up and do this morning all over again, knowing what she knew now. She and Yang could have fled with the crystal safely in their grasp and gone off to hide it, instead of now chasing after it and diving into what was sure to be uncertain danger, sabotaging monsters aside. This has undoubtedly been the longest day of my life. Everything I thought I knew, and everything I thought was sacred, it's all been turned on its head. And even though I'm with Father, I've never felt so alone. An hour later, Ursula and Yang were settling down to dinner with the monks, who had managed to land a few fresh catches for them, when they heard yet another commotion coming from the crew who was standing watch of the ship.
There's a damn cyan craft starboard, Captain.
A sailor exclaimed, and Yang and Ursula lifted their heads from their meal in curiosity.
Ha ha.
The captain laughed jovially, all of the stress from the monster attack long forgotten now as he pulled out his scope and peered through.
Is that Captain Cowan manning the ship, eh? We're racing her to the docks, ya dogs. Aye aye, sir.
The sailors laughed, and Yang stood up, approaching the west railing. Curious, Ursula set her makeshift plate down and followed him, peering over his shoulder.
A Damsian ship.
Yang blinked, trying to peer through the darkness. Sure enough, a vessel with black and gold Damsian banners had begun to drift into view, traveling from the northeast. In the distance, Ursula could hear the two captains of their respective ships giving each other hell as they shouted over the rolling waves. Two figures were approaching the new vessel's deck, one of them raising a lantern.
Is that Yang?
A man as pale as moonlight itself lifted his lantern further out, narrowing his eyes. The sea spray had made soft waves out of his sandy blonde hair, which he fussily pushed back behind his ears. A white cloak rippled gently in the wind, and he tugged down at his jade and saffron scarf, pulling it away from his mouth so that it fell just below his throat. His secretary, a willowy woman who was concealed under layers of tunics and coats to combat the nighttime chill, raised her eyebrows and pushed her glasses further up her nose.
As in the King of Fabul?
He nodded excitedly.
Yes. You could not find a stronger or gentler monarch. Nor one half so brave. It's been ages since we last spoke.
Yang shouted across the sea. Now that their ships had finally managed to get closer, there was no doubt now who was on the other vessel, and it couldn't have been a coincidence on why they were here.
Edward. Are you sailing for Baron as well? Yes, that's right.
Edward exclaimed, and his secretary approached the railing of the ship, pressing her lips together. She saw that it was not only Yang on board, he was accompanied by Princess Ursula, and a company of monks. In other words, it wasn't a merry little family vacation.
Their destination is the same as ours.
She blinked. Edward turned to face her.
Indeed. Fabul has picked up on the same signs we have, no doubt. Ah, what a shot of confidence, knowing that he's on our side.
Edward's ship pulled further ahead, and soon Yang could no longer see them. Fully expecting the captain to bark new orders to the crew, apparently, they were in a race now. After all, he waited patiently for them to eventually catch up so that he and Edward could continue their impromptu conversation. But after a few more minutes, they had actually seemed to be slowing down, their sails had deflated considerably, and were impotently flapping above them with nothing to do. Yang glanced up, and Ursula frowned.
It appears we're losing speed.
Damsian's ship disappeared into the night, and the captain approached.
Looks like those monsters did more damage than I thought.
He shook his head, glaring at a few crew members who were staring at the sails, slack-jawed.
Don't just sit there. This ship needs repairs, men. Get to it. Aye, sir.
Yang and Ursula reluctantly returned to their dinners, which had grown ice-cold. As they listened to the crew bolt up and down the stairs to and from the hold and shout expletives, Ursula swallowed the last of her fish, letting a yawn slip out. Just as she was contemplating the merits of taking a nap, the captain returned again, and Yang stood up to meet him.
Well. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it looks like we sustained some serious damage to the rudder and the propeller. What? So what happens now?
The captain shook his head.
The monsters really gunked things up down there. They must have been gnawing at the hull of the ship before they came aboard, because the sailors discovered flooding where the mechanics for those pieces are housed. We can drain the flooding, but parts that control the hull and the propeller are disintegrating from the monsters' acid excretions. Without either of those things, we're going to lose velocity, which means we'll move at a crawl unless we get some hurricane-level winds to push us along. I'm willing to keep going until we get to the nearest shore, but we can't go much more than that, I'm afraid, or the parts will simply break under the strain of normal operation. The closest shore.
Ursula frowned.
We're not anywhere near Baron, are we? Correct. We're closest now to the Adamant Isles.
As they drifted toward the chain of tiny islands that were becoming visible to the west, Yang asked the captain to show him the damage. They descended under the ship, and Ursula slumped onto the deck, burying her head in her hands. Unbelievable. What else could possibly go wrong? When the captain and Yang emerged from the deck, they were still talking, and the sailors were preparing to dock the ship at the shore.
So some sort of lubricant could allow us to operate at full power again.
The captain nodded.
Some palm oil should work. It's not the best lubricant in the world, but it'll do for now. The real benefit would be the enzymes it has to reverse some of the damage. Someone would have to be down there to constantly reapply for the duration of the trip, but we could manage it.
Yang crossed his arms over his chest.
I apologize for being blunt, Captain, but we are on urgent business. I know. This is the best I can come up with if our only resource is this island.
He gestured toward the landmass they had managed to dock at safely, a small stretch of sand that was swallowed by a shadow-drenched forest. The light of the twin moons might have been able to provide guidance, but that was only if it could penetrate the scores of trees rising high into the air.
Let's just get what we need and get moving again. Remember that this is an unexplored island, so there's no telling what's out there. We're too far from the island the village of Mithril is on to get back up.
Yang nodded thoughtfully.
Then I'll go. I can spot a palm tree easily enough.
Ursula tugged at Yang's arm.
Father, I'm coming too. You will wait here,
Yang ordered, and Ursula sulked, but dared not argue. If she caused enough trouble, Yang might drop her off in Mithril once they were seaworthy again and go to Baron by himself.
Let us go with you, Master.
Bale exclaimed, and Yang shook his head.
Enough worrying about me. I will be back in a short time. Stay here with Ursula, all right? Be careful.
The captain warned, and Yang lumbered down the gangplank of the ship, disappearing from sight. A few moments later, Ursula watched his form bob against the sands of the beach, and then enter the depths of the forest, without once ever looking back at them. Ursula looked away, drifting into the hold of the ship. After peeking through a few ajar and closed doors, she found a closet-sized berth where she could take a nap in relative peace. As she slumped into the hard, scratchy bed, she saw him poke his head in the room.
Resting up, Princess?
She nodded glumly.
Don't worry. I'm not going to run off. We'll just be on the deck if you need anything,
and said kindly, and closed the door. Ursula sighed, turning onto her side and closing her eyes.
Father.
When she opened her eyes again, she found herself in Baron Castle. Morning sunlight was warming her body through stained glass windows, and she was now in a luxurious pile of silk and satin blankets, her head resting upon a jewel-toned pillow filled with downy feathers.
Hey.
Ursula blinked, sitting up and rubbing her eyes.
How did I?
The room was empty save for a few vases of flowers and nondescript banners and antique weaponry hanging from the walls, nothing that helped indicate where she actually was. As she swung her legs out of bed, her bare toes brushed against something velvety, she bent down and picked it up, pinching it between her fingers. It was a blood-red rose petal, and there were scores more of them winding around the bed and leading to a bow window identical to the one in her bedroom back home. It had been left slightly open, the summer breeze drifting in like a hug from an old friend.
Hello.
Ursula called, standing up and looking around. Silence greeted her in reply, and she realized with a twist of her stomach that she couldn't actually see a door that would allow her to exit. Maybe there's a balcony underneath the window? How did I get in here in the first place if there is no door? The rose petals crunching under her feet as she wandered over to the window, Ursula hesitantly pressed her palm to the glass, gazing out. Below, she had the perfect view of Baron's beautiful rose gardens, a well-kept secret spot that only the royal family and a few close friends regularly spent any time in. Blooms of all colors were exploding in every corner, overgrown bushes lolling into the ivory brick pathways and tendrils of vines climbing up the garden walls. As her eyes swept over the scenery below, her breath caught in her throat when she spotted the first body, blue and twisted in an inhuman shape. It was a woman dressed in white, her blonde hair shining like liquid gold over the pure white petals of the roses her mangled body was thrown upon. Patches of red blossomed beneath her, staining the surrounding flowers that had become her final resting place a watery pink. Queen Rosa. Ursula let out a scream, banging her fists against the windows, the glass refusing to yield to her strength. Across the way, she spotted another body, it too, curled in an unnatural way, a long torso, slender legs, and silver hair the color of moonlight hiding the face she knew belonged to Cecil Harvey, who was face down in a bed of pink roses. A stain of red was streaked over his shattered crystal-plated armor in the middle of his back, the still fresh blood cascading down his ribs. Cecil too. Gods, why? There came footsteps, and Ursula's eyes jerked to a new figure who had entered the garden. It was a tall young man, with floppy platinum blonde hair, wearing the uniform of a Red Wings cadet with a red and white scarf trailing down his back. For a moment, his eyes traveled to the window Ursula was pressed against, the crystal blue orbs so luminous that she wanted to dive into them like an ocean and submerge herself in their sacred light.
Theodore!
Ursula cried, her fingers wrenching at the window as she tried to pry it open further.
Don't look!
But another figure emerged, tearing Theodore's attention away from the window. He gazed up, enthralled as Cain Highwind entered the garden. His helmet was removed, but all Ursula could see was his back. His hair had been liberated from its ponytail, and was falling over his body like a curtain. Cain reached out, lifting Theodore's chin in his hand and tilting it slightly, as if to direct him to something. Theodore eagerly obeyed, his eyes falling on Cecil's broken body. Ursula watched with horror as Theodore sank to his knees, and Cain reached behind him, unsheathing his lance and positioning it directly above Theodore's left shoulder, where it would plunge straight through and find its mark in his heart.
Theodore!
Ursula wailed, closing her eyes and throwing her entire body into the window. The glass shattered, raining down in slow motion as Ursula plummeted forward, tears obscuring her vision. Just as her feet were about to touch the ground, she heard the wet sound of flesh tearing asunder, and saw the lance drive into Theodore's back. He arched his body in shock, his eyes wide as a trail of blood escaped his bow-shaped lips. Ursula felt a shadow wash over her, strong arms wrapping around her waist as a knife flicked open against her throat, the ice-cold blade reflecting the images of the twin moons hanging low in the sky.
Father! AHHHH!
Ursula shot up in bed, her hands immediately flying to her throat as she desperately inspected it for blood. When she felt nothing but streaks of sweat, she took a shaky breath, pushing her fingers through her hair and trying to fight the sobs that were caught in her chest. What the hell was that? She barreled out of bed and stomped up the stairs to the deck, where the sky had grown yet darker. The monks were sitting around a fire on the beach, talking animatedly. Most of the crew appeared to be asleep on top of various crates strewn about the ship. Ursula marched to the gangplank, but saw no sign of Yang emerging from the woods. The captain approached her, gently resting his hand on her shoulder and making her shriek and jump.
Don't worry. Master Yang will be back before you know it.
It's been hours. What if something happened? Her mind immediately replayed Theodore slaying from her nightmare, and she almost got sick on the deck right then and there. What if he... She whirled around, swinging her legs over the ledge and lowering them onto the gangplank.
I'm going. What?
The captain cried, and Ursula broke into a run across the sands before anyone could stop her. The three monks looked up from their fire, scrambling to their feet as she was swallowed whole by the woods.
Princess Ursula!
Cole called out, and they took off after her. Ursula paused once she had run a few more yards, panting and pressing her palms to her knees as she caught her breath. She had realized upon entering the forest that she had secretly been hoping Yang was just on his way out, and that would be the end of it. However, all signs indicated that no one had been here for a very long time, and it was eerily quiet. How far in did my father go, anyway?
Princess!
Anne cried, and she turned to see the three monks catching up with her.
Are you okay? You shout out of the ship like a bat out of hell. Do you think it's suspicious that my father hasn't returned yet?
Ursula replied, and they paused.
Well. Yes, it's rather unusual for Master Yang to not complete a task as efficiently and quickly as possible,
Vale admitted.
But he also told you not to follow him. Well, if I am not mistaken, his orders for you to protect me trump something as silly as that.
Ursula pursed her lips.
So are you coming with me, or not?
Fabul, 17 years prior.
Well, I'd best get things going for dinner.
Thanks. Sheila leaned in, kissing Yang on the temple before sauntering off to their ensuite kitchen in the western tower. It had only been a few months since he had officially been crowned as king, and she queen, but she couldn't be happier that seemingly nothing had changed at all. She hated all the fancy ceremony that came with the title, even in Fabul, where fanciness was at a minimum, it was still too much for her. She had grown up in a household raised by a harried single father and 5 older brothers, decorum was a foreign concept. Immediately upon being crowned at her coronation, Sheila posed for a painter to sketch her in her tiara and gown, and immediately ran upstairs to strip her clothes off and drop the tiara into a box that got shoved into the back of the wardrobe, never to see the light of day again. She refused the Duke Consort's generous offer for them to take over his suite. What she and Yang had was just fine, Thank you very much, and it had her most favorite thing in the world, her own wood-burning stove, so she could cook Yang his favorite dishes whenever she pleased. After Yang had come home from the war, he made it his personal mission to raise the ranks of the Fabulian monks once more, being that all of their most seasoned warriors perished in a freak monster attack on Mount Hobbs, leaving only students in the castle when Yang had joined the war effort. Throwing himself into his training hadn't been much of a change since before war had broken out, but Sheila had noticed that now when he came home, he had a bounce in his step and a glint in his eyes she hadn't seen since they were engaged. It made home life a lot more exciting, and as a result, she was keeping to herself a secret that was about to bring them a lot more happiness in the coming months. Finally, everything was coming together, the life they had dreamed of when they were children was at last in their grasp. Yes, it had come a little later than both had expected, but when the reward was this wonderful, what was a year or 10? Unfortunately for Sheila, her body had been rebelling at the idea of keeping her secret much longer, and she was finding it harder and harder to keep her symptoms hidden from Yang, who was normally as observant as a hawk about everything she did. If she even cracked an egg differently at breakfast, he would be asking her what was wrong. That was what happened when your wedding anniversary crawled into the double digits. As she exited the throne room, Sheila felt the telltale rolling of her stomach, and the sickness rising in her throat. Gagging at the taste, she covered her mouth and doubled over, trying to swallow it back down before Yang noticed. Morning sickness is a joke, this nastiness comes whenever it damn well pleases. Yang immediately leapt from the throne, rushing to Sheila's side.
What is it?
Sheila stood back up, blanching a bit at the burning sensation in her throat as she pressed her fingers to her lips.
Oh, nothing.
Yang looked her up and down.
You look pale, my dear.
Sheila flushed.
I'm fine. I'm not sick or anything.
Oops. That was a bit too obvious, wasn't it? Yang put his hands on his hips.
Then. What?
Sheila watched him for a moment, and then smiled, shaking her head. Hell, now was as good a time as any. They were alone, the castle was relatively quiet, and happy news before dinner always made it taste better anyway.
Hee hee. It's a child, our child.
Yang blinked, his mustache twitching in confusion.
What?
Sheila smiled harder, her jaw clenched.
Aren't you happy?
Yang nodded, turning away and blushing fiercely.
Of course I am. I just thought. Well, after all this time. I thought we couldn't. Sheila. You've created a miracle. We have, hun.
Adamant Isle, current day. Perhaps further in. Yang had gotten lost, again. Between this labyrinth of a forest and his persistent daydreaming, he didn't even want to know how long he had been away from the ship. He knew time was of the essence, but for once in his life, he just couldn't bring himself to concentrate on the task at hand. Worst of all, it was now so dark out that he didn't even think he could identify a palm tree if he came across one. He had realized only too late when he had entered the forest that he wasn't exactly sure what one looked like. Maybe I should have brought Ursula, after all. Lately, it seems as if I do not know the right thing to do until well after the fact. I wonder when that started happening? Fable, 16 years prior.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yang nodded disinterestedly along as Bale and Cole practiced their stances, flowing gracefully from one move to the next. They kept glancing at each other nervously, wondering if Master Yang was about to pass out. He was so pale and sweaty, as if he had exerted himself, yet he hadn't moved an inch since he had ordered their impromptu training session. Only moments earlier, the King and Queen of Baron had arrived, and had made their way to the Western Tower, where Queen Sheila had been ensconced all morning, yet Yang had refused to even glance behind him. Finally, after another round of exercises, stopped, and Bale and Cole gingerly paused as well, legs mid-air.
Master Yang.
Breathed. Yang said nothing, he was in a total daze.
Master Yang.
Yang blinked, looking up.
What? Done already?
Bale snorted.
Won't you even take a day like this off?
Yang reddened, raising a finger.
Training exists especially for days like this. Assuming your mind is in it, that is.
The Duke consort appeared behind them, his eyebrows raised at this most amusing exchange. Yang turned to face him, flustered.
Duke. She'll be giving birth any moment now. Go now, and be by her side. But...
Yang looked down at his feet. On a battlefield, he had some use. In a hospital room, not so much. Wouldn't he just get in the way?
Wah. Wah.
A baby's cry erupted from the western tower like a pealing church bell. Yang gasped, his heart pounding furiously in his chest. Could it really be?
Master Yang!
Cole exclaimed, and gave him a shove from behind.
Go on. Hurry.
Yang found that his feet were flying before he could even comprehend what he was doing, glancing back to the others before bursting through the courtyard doors.
Right.
Adamant Isle, current day.
This is insane.
Ursula growled as she stomped through the underbrush, a tree branch coming close to smacking her in the head. Before any of the monks could warn her, her hand flew up, grasping the branch and snapping it in half as easily as if it were a twig. As she tossed it away without a second thought, Bale and Cole exchanged a secret look, their eyes wide with awe. They knew what Master Yang seemed to not understand, that out of all of his students Fabul, and perhaps even out of all the students he had ever trained, including themselves, none were a natural-born fighter with as much raw potential as Princess Ursula. With the proper training, she stood to become a legend, but it didn't look like that was ever going to happen, for reasons they had never known, nor ever dared to question. Fabul, 10 years prior.
Yeah. Ha.
The little girl took a deep breath, pressing her palms together and bowing deeply to indicate she was finished with her routine. Yang could barely contain his pleasure as he clapped his hands.
Whoa. Nice work, Ursula.
He exclaimed, and she gazed up at him.
Really? Really?
Ursula giggled.
So I can be big and strong like you someday, Daddy.
Yang smiled happily, kneeling down and wrapping his arms around her.
Oh, of course, of course. Yippee!
Ursula squealed, wriggling out of his embrace and dancing erratically. Yang stood back up, shaking his head.
Ah, but remember, Ursula, there's something I want you to cherish even more than that. Do you remember what I told you?
Ursula raised an eyebrow as she kept dancing.
No way. I'm gonna be big and strong like you, Daddy, that's all I care about.
She struck a pose, flexing her tiny biceps and letting out a growl.
Gooer. Ursula, the little bear, ready for action.
Adamant Isle, current day. Yang came to another dead end, letting out a sigh. Everything really was starting to look the same now, save for the sky. Dawn was on the verge of breaking, ushering them into a new day, and still the twin moons hung in the sky above, silently observing the lost king. Yang let a yawn slip out, standing on his toes and extending his arms high in the air to allow himself to at least enjoy a satisfying stretch. How long had it been since he had last been up all night like this? It had used to be when he was younger, he would stay out all night training with his brothers in class, and after Ursula was born, nights became ripe for her tears and illnesses, and finally, when she had finally been able to sleep through the night and move into her own room, nights were back to being for Sheila and himself, where they would promptly pass out and attempt to brave the new day. Parenthood was more exhausting than any war. As Yang lowered his arms, he swore he heard the snap of a twig, or several. Holding his breath, he slowly pivoted, trying to pick up the sound again. He wasn't alone, some Thin-Ji was in the forest with him. Fabul, 3 years prior.
Hun. What?
Sheila had returned to the throne room, where Yang was still slumping against his throne, staring into nothingness. Ursula had had a blowout fight, resulting in buckets of tears, Ursula, and bellowing that had surely scared off the neighborhood monsters. Yang Sheila had finally been able to implore Ursula to retreat to her bedroom, where Sheila had tried to calm her down and convince her to go to sleep and start fresh the next day. It had only been after Sheila had successfully lured a student to keep watch after Ursula's bedroom to nix any thoughts of running away that she felt safe enough to go back downstairs to her husband.
When are you going to start giving Ursula her formal training?
Sheila asked, and Yang glanced up at her.
You too, hey? My answer is the same as what I told her tonight, not until she understands it for herself.
Sheila sighed.
Understands what for herself? Kindness. Honor. She is kind. And where could you find a more honorable young lady?
Yang looked away.
True enough, but she still yearns for strength above everything else in her life. Everything.
Sheila nearly burst into laughter, and had to cover her mouth.
This, coming from you? I say what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Yang looked up at her, and the darkness of his eyes made her think better about letting the laugh slip out. There was something mournful in his gaze, something she hadn't seen since the day Ursula had been born.
She's my daughter. My one and only daughter. After everything you, I, and Fable have been through, my dearest wish for her is to only ever know peace. That's all I have ever wanted since the moment I held her in my arms.
Adamant Isle, current day.
Palm trees.
Ursula exclaimed, falling to her knees dramatically and raising her fists in the air.
We did it. Praise the gods.
They had broken into a small clearing, dawn's light starting to trickle through the canopy of the forest. Clustered in a little colony were a variety of palm trees, each oozing with plenty of oil for the taking. Ursula held out her hand, and Cole dutifully handed her the first several bottles they had emptied on their journey through the forest. It had only been after they were thoroughly lost that they realized they didn't have anything to bring the palm oil back in, if they found it before they found Yang. Ursula had insisted they suck down any extra potions they had on hand and save the bottles. They hadn't encountered any monsters, and they needed the energy to plod through anyway, since no one was getting any sleep.
This ought to be enough.
Ursula smiled as she filled the last bottle, and handed it back to the monks.
Anyway, now that daylight will be here soon, it will be much easier to look for father and get out of here. Let's get these back to the ship, and we can strategize. MRRRRRGRRRRR.
Ursula turned around, a scream catching in her throat. Bale and Cole had silently surrounded her, their arms extended. A massive adamantoise had bellied up to them, completely blocking the exit from the clearing that would take them on the path back to the ship. A blueskin tortoise with poison-tipped fangs that fell into a bucket of steroids. Adamantoises were typically harmless to humans, unless one were to stumble into its nest, which it considered an act of aggression. And unfortunately, this one had been particularly fond of palm trees, and was just returning home after a night of hunting.
Princess.
And glanced at her over his shoulder.
Stay back. We'll handle this.
Ursula backed up until her rear hit one of the palm trees, her eyes wide. This was the biggest monster she had ever seen in her life. Could 3 monks really take it down? She watched as Bale and Cole rushed forward, relentlessly showering the beast with kicks and blows, but nothing seemed to faze it. I think they're just making it angrier. Unfortunately, the confirmation of her thought followed quickly. With one sweep of its warty flipper, the adamantoise caught all 3 monks at once, bulldozing them into a stunned pile of bodies until they smacked into a tree. Ursula gasped, ignoring the monster's eyes trailing her form as she ran to the monks, kneeling at their side and checking for grievous injuries.
Are you okay?
Ursula cried, digging in her pouch for her last remaining potions. With the monks had insisted she keep on her even as they were emptying their other bottles.
Here, you each need to drink one of these. Princess. Those are yours.
Cole moaned. And shook his head.
Just run, princess. You'll need those in case you run into anything on the way to the ship. No way.
Ursula cried, popping a cork off one potion and forcing it down Anne's throat.
I'm not leaving you, we're going to escape together. Do you hear me?
She shoved the other 2 uncorked potions in Bale and Cole's hands, respectively, and whirled around to face the adamantoise, who had now fully become entranced by Ursula and was making its way toward her, flipper raised.
No.
Ursula cried, throwing her arms out to protect the others.
You're gonna have to go through me if you want them again.
Her voice trailed off as her eyes frantically searched the adamantoise. She had been observing where the monks had made their attacks, all of which were grossly ineffective. But still, there had to be at least one weak point she could exploit somewhere. Fabul, 6 months prior. A giant boulder had been rolled into the courtyard that morning by Yang and a few of the other high monks. 2 students were taking turns punching and kicking at the boulder, but after 10 tiring minutes, they both collapsed on the ground simultaneously, breathing heavily and rubbing their raw, bleeding knuckles.
What? Is that all?
Yang raised his eyebrows. He had been observing them silently from a corner. One of the students looked up, wiping the sweat from his brow.
This is impossible, Master Yang. It's just too hard.
Yang glanced to the other student, who could only nod his agreement. He was still catching his breath. Yang shook his head.
Trying to crush it through sheer force will only serve to bruise your knuckles. Every object has a weak point, that includes humans and monsters. Find it, concentrate upon it.
With one precise kick, Yang slammed his foot down upon the boulder, and it shattered into dust and gravel before their eyes.
And you no longer need to exhaust your strength. It's a technique called Tenketsu.
The 2 students stared in awe, quietly applauding Yang. Hidden away on an overlook, Ursula pressed her lips together, her eyes wide.
Tenketsu.
Adamant Isle, current day.
Father. I'll try my best.
Ursula whispered to herself, her eyes focused on what looked like a hairline fracture on the adamantist's shell. Taking a running leap, she propelled herself off of the adamantist's skull, somersaulting in the air and drilling her foot into the heart of the fracture. With a jarring crack, the shell split open, the monster throwing its head back in dismay as Ursula bounced away and watched it fall off in 2 halves with an earth-shaking crash, leaving its back and underbelly completely vulnerable to attack now. Ursula felt a strange presence behind her. Whirling around, she saw Yang watching her from behind 2 tall bushes, his brows knitted together and his mouth set in the slightest of smiles.
Father.
Ursula cried, but he shook his head.
Keep your eyes on the enemy. Right.
Ursula nodded, turning back to the adamantoise and diving back into the fray to deal out more hurt. This time, the monks, now fully recovered thanks to her medicine, joined in too, and within minutes, the beast finally gave up and collapsed to the ground, a death rattle escaping its throat as it started to crumble into dust. Ursula sighed in relief, running over to the monks to check on them once more.
Everyone good?
She chirped, and they all nodded, beaming.
Well done.
Yang had emerged from the woods and come up behind her, nodding approvingly at the fast-fading monster. Ursula flushed, immediately bowing down and folding her hands.
Father. I'm so sorry. I know I disobeyed your wishes. I had a nightmare on the ship and became terrified. I let my emotions weaken my resolve and the result was a rash decision.
Yang raised his eyebrows, kneeling down so that he could face her.
Ursula. I saw everything. You always had strength. But now, it is affirmed by the heart to save your companions in need.
Ursula raised her head, the tip of her nose stained red, a telltale sign she was about to burst into tears.
I only carried out what you taught me to do, Father.
Yang grasped her hands, pulling her along with him back to their feet.
From this moment on, consider yourself my newest disciple.
Ursula blinked. Did he say what I think he just said?
You mean?
Yang smiled.
Don't expect special treatment, though. Not even my own daughter is allowed that luxury. Father.
Ursula gasped, throwing her arms around him. Yang patted her on the back, still not being able to help but grin.
Spare me your tears. I am no longer your father. I am now master to you. Yes, master.
Ursula pulled away, smiling and bowing once more.
Off to Baron, then, we've still a long way to go.
The party made their way back to the ship just as the sun had fully risen over the horizon, only a few patchy clouds in the sky joining in for the day. A fierce northbound wind had begun to pick up. Ursula wondered if the Crystal of Wind had heard their silent prayers all the way from Baron, or wherever it was now.
Master Yang. Princess. You've all come back safely.
The captain exclaimed as they made their way aboard.
Will this work for you?
Yang asked, and the monks proceeded to hand over all the bottles of palm oil they had been carrying. The captain nodded eagerly.
Amazing work, my liege. This should do fine. I need no thanks.
Yang glanced over at Ursula.
My pupil did all the work.
The captain blinked.
Pupil. I have been accepted as Master Yang's newest disciple.
Ursula exclaimed, and wanted to squeal at just how right that sounded coming out of her mouth. Oh, how she had longed to say those very words for so long. The captain shook his head, eyes watering.
Princess. What an amazing day for you.
Ursula blushed, waving the comment away. She realized the old her would have relished in the praise and acknowledgement, but as Master Yang's pupil, she had to work on her humbleness perhaps just a bit.
Please call me Ursula. Is there anything I can do to help? Well, if you're offering, I'll need help refining this palm oil to make it a usable lubricant. It needs to be brought to a certain temperature first. Could you lend a hand? If we work together, we should be to Varen in the blink of an eye. Sure.
As the ship made sail once again, Ursula fluttered about the deck, making sure her assistance was no longer needed before finally settling back in with Yang. She had noticed the entire time she was working that he hadn't said a word to anyone, not even an Bale or Cole, and had been staring out at the ocean since they departed. Ursula cleared her throat as she stood beside him.
Master.
Yang tore his gaze away from the sea, looking down at her.
What is it?
He realized he had never asked her about the nightmare she had told him had spurred her to flee the ship, and wondered if she would be willing to share it with him. Ursula bit her lip, the wind tearing a lock of hair out of one of her pigtails and sending it whipping across her cheek.
I feel a tremendous sense of foreboding ahead of us. At first, I was so happy we were moving forward, but it's all suddenly faded away.
Yang nodded sadly.
So you've noticed it, too?
That turncoat Kane had been correct, she was undoubtedly her father's daughter.
Yes.
Ursula trailed off, her eyes darkening as Theodore's death at Kane's hands danced before her once again. She felt a dull throb in her heart, even though it had all just been a dream. Theodore. It didn't occur to me until now that you must be as scared as I for Uncle Cecil. I pray you are safe, and that my dream meant nothing. Yang suddenly stepped away from Ursula, calling out to the crew on the ship.
Lash yourselves to the ship.
The captain blinked, so surprised that he let go of the steering wheel.
Wah. Now. Do it.
Yang growled, and the captain gulped. What choice did he have if it was an order from his king?
Why yes, your highness.
The captain and his crew scrambled to secure themselves to the ship using any means necessary, some hauled out ropes, others unfurled supplies that had been held in place by bungee cord and strapped themselves in instead. Ursula watched Yang in shock as he continued to stare toward the horizon.
This dread I feel,
he murmured.
It's just like back then.
The ship began to shudder violently, and Ursula tripped forward, catching herself on a mast before crashing to her knees and clinging to it for dear life. I knew it. Ahead of them, the ocean began to twist fiercely, the ship groaning as it spiraled toward a whirlpool that had broken the surface. Turbulent bands of water smashed into the sides of the vessel, and Ursula let out a scream as she heard the first pangs of wood splintering and snapping apart beneath them. Behind her, she could hear the monks murmuring among themselves, and the sailors simultaneously cursing and praying aloud.
Why is this happening?
Ursula cried, turning her head toward Yang as salty spray washed over her. His unblinking stare had risen to the twin moons, an unsettling veil of serenity cast over his features.
I can feel it. The seas are being guarded no longer. He would not allow this to pass. Not again, and not knowing what he does now. What? Who? The Lord of the Seas, Leviathan. He's absent from his domain, perhaps not even of this dimension any longer. I suppose the same can be said of the sylphs as well. What does that all mean?
Ursula sniffled, and Yang finally turned to look at her, his gaze somber as another wave crashed over them.
It means this is beyond Varen, and beyond mere crystals, our world is facing an unprecedented crisis.
End of chapter.